we'll get started.
Hey, Brad, looks like you're trying to make a point from our conversation last night.
Yeah, I am. I realize it's not inside the city limits, but this seems to be the concern of everybody.
I just wanted you to acknowledge that I appreciate that. I just want you to know I got the joke or the
Yeah.
point.
I have some others, but that was the tamest.
All right.
Glad you enlarged the screen because at first I thought it was his vehicle collection.
Yeah, it's not that many.
No, there's more than what you have there.
Mine are all old and classic.
Oh, cool.
All right, well, we're just after 3 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. We do have a lot of material to cover, so I just want to welcome everybody to the February 17 Citywide Advisory Committee meeting. Last month, we had an exciting endeavor. We released Module 2 and the accompanying documents that went with that. So you've had an opportunity to review those materials, which we'll have an opportunity to discuss this as we move forward. Another important component is our community outreach began last week. We've had an opportunity to meet with the community on 3 separate occasions. And then we've also had an opportunity to meet with the City Council, the Planning and Zoning Commission, as well as the Design Review Committee to kind of get them up to speed on where we're at and how they can participate in the process. So as part of the community outreach, actually 7 of you have attended at least one of those meetings. Some of you have attended even more, and we appreciate that. We would continue to encourage you to participate in those events. It's really good to hear what our community members are talking about, what they're saying, and really listening to them. So I would just go ahead and encourage you to check out that calendar of events and attend as many as you can. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and save some time so that we have more time to discuss those important topics from Module 2, those community engagement, and then get started in Module 3. So I'm going to hand it over to Don and let him take the show.
All right, thank you. Good to see all those faces again, and even the names without the faces that are attending. I look forward to these meetings. I'm going to share a screen here so we can get our presentation up, and assuming I can, let's see. Somebody tell me whether that's visible at this point.
Yep, you're good to go.
Don, we're 2 years into the pandemic. If you can't share the screen by now, you're fired. That's all there is to it.
That's pretty harsh.
Well, you know, it's like we
would have been
mess
fired
around
by
anymore.
now. Yeah, okay. All right. So are we looking at the presentation screen without the preview screen? Is it a full screen?
No, you're looking at you got to switch it, Don.
All right. So what do I do up here?
Go to display settings.
Display settings up at the top. I see. Yep. All right. And just switch them, right?
Mm-hmm.
How about that?
There you go.
All right. Thank you. See, with assistance. So maybe I'm just not fired, but suspended at this point.
Yeah, well, we were going to put you on a PIP, but you just saved yourself. So
thank you. Got it. Thank you. Got it. Saved by the bell. All right. We have, as Andre said, a very big agenda today. This is a transition meeting. There was, as Andre said, a lot of meat, a lot of substance in the module. We probably could use a lot of time to review that, but we're not going to do that. We're going to try to contain that part of this. Reactions, questions, discussion on Module 2. As we've said many times, the door is never closed. And we have received a number of comments from you about the Module 2. Not only that, but the conversion map, approaches to parking, and some comments about the balance of our discussions between, it seems like we're always talking residential, and shouldn't we also be talking about the mixed use and the activity centers? So we've received a variety of different questions I would like to, and then we're going to spend most of this, like 3/4 of this meeting, talking through the transition into installment 3, module 3, which is administration and procedures. So let's say about the first quarter of this, and we're just going to contain the conversation so we can move ahead and lay the foundation for the next chapter. If we don't have time to get to your questions today, please do put them in writing and circulate them as for the not only the CAC, the advisory committee here, but all the comments that we get are being rolled into thinking about what changes need to be made as we go down the road. So about 1/4 of the time on discussion on module 2 and the conversion map, and then the rest of it on module 3. And with that, I'm going to kind of lay this out a little bit, and I'd make a suggestion just as a reminder to you. This is the 12 chapters. This list is the 12 different, highly complicated, diverse topics that are covered in what was released last month. I'm only putting this up in case it's helpful to you in saying, oh yeah, I had a question about sensitive lands. Oh yeah, I had a question about building design and how that's going to work. So we're going to take a little bit of time, say 30 more minutes, to take questions. And I would like to suggest the following. If you have already put in writing your questions to Andrea, to anybody at the city, to us, by the way, if the only people who've written to us so far have been as copies of comments to Andrea. So please do that. We always need to have Andrea and the staff and Lena and others involved in knowing what these discussions are going on. So if you want to copy us, that's fine. If not, they usually forward them straight on to us for discussion. But if you already sent your comments in, let's not repeat them now. We'll either answer them in writing or we're aware of them and we'll bring them into the drafting process. I would like to start by saying, if somebody has had a chance to look at this and has not put their comments in writing, you have been too busy, you were in the process and then things got ahead of you, or you're just beginning to review it now, but you have questions, I would suggest that we do that first to make sure that everybody on the committee has a chance to comment, even if they did not have to go in writing. And I'd rather make sure we hear all of the comments that people are ready to make today before we dive down into the details of any particular comment. If we do that for a few minutes and it turns out that it seems like anybody who's ready to comment today has commented, then we'll move on. We can go into a little bit more detail of specific answers to specific questions that have been raised. But in the meantime, let's just throw it out. And here are just the discussion questions we had prepared. Do you have any thoughts about the concepts or the content of the module? What about the zoning conversion map? Once again, if you've commented in writing, we've got it. If you haven't commented in writing, but you are concerned or you don't understand it, that would be fodder for this discussion. And, you know, Andrea said, 7 of you have been had a chance to attend an outreach event, but if you have comments about that, let's go ahead and hear those comments too. So I'll be quiet and see if anybody wants to talk a little bit about who has not already put their comments in writing first, and we'll go from there.
Roberta, it looks like you've got your hand raised.
Yes, thanks. I'm going to just jump to attending the community meetings. And I was reflecting on that this morning because I also attended some of the meetings from the early days of this event. You know, we've been involved with this this group for 1.5 years, and it's good to lay the foundational pieces at the meetings, but it strikes me when I go to the meetings, and I'm sure others will voice their opinions, it's hard for now, I feel like I actually understand this a little bit more as far as the process with module and module 2. But if there was any way to help people at the meetings and throughout the city that if you do this, or if this is happening in your neighborhood, it's sort of like a sample document. If X, then Y. It's just some thoughts because what I've heard and is density remains an issue, parking remains an issue, housing affordability for all remains an issue. and I could go on, and I'm sure you have statistical analysis. I don't really have a solution how to help people understand it, but it's a lot to digest. So that's my thoughts for the moment.
And Marissa, you've got your hand raised as well. Marissa, are you there? Well, it looks like we aren't able to hear from her quite yet. But we do have Patrick also with his hand raised, and then maybe Marissa will be ready.
Hi, I have a laundry list of particulars that I haven't turned in writing, but honestly, it's probably better in writing. Like it's like this number on this page, this number on this page, and this and this. So I'll kind of, I see Don potentially nodding a little bit. Maybe it's better if I just submit the long laundry list in writing versus go through them in like a tick fashion now, though I'd be happy to do so. Is that a fair assumption of probably the most appropriate use of time, Don?
I would think so.
Okay.
I think because often when the questions come in, it involves a little back and forth between us and Andrea and Lena and other people at the staff and Diane Kushlin. And so anyway, we often need to bat it around a little bit. So we'd probably be better prepared to answer if you put it in writing, Patrick. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do exactly that. One general question I have is that as I reviewed the code in detail, I tried to figure out where in our code, you know, what you might call a classic row house, 3-ish stories, right next to each other, minimal setback. It's kind of a transitional zone that allows for ownership. They're generally more affordable than homes in larger lots. Where, if anywhere, that belongs in our city. And as best I can tell, that, you know, like unless you're going to put it in like MXD or something, and even there, there's some setback concerns that like. It kind of feels like that housing topology is completely banned as far as I can tell. And maybe I'm missing that, and if I am, I'd love to hear a little bit about where kind of a row house topology would make sense and be allowed in the zoning code as written. I couldn't find anywhere that I thought seemed to fit in.
All right, I'm popping up the code on a different screen, which is why I'm looking this way. I think we have an answer for that, but let me look quickly at that unless Gabby has an answer or Andrea has an answer quicker than I can look it up.
So we do have, oh, go ahead.
It's allowed in many places. It's traveling under the name single family attached. That is a row house.
Okay.
It's allowed in many districts. It's allowed in R1B, R1C, R2, R3. MXN, yes, almost most of
that's the name it's traveling under, and that's what you mean by that. Cool.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'll review it again with that framing. Appreciate that.
Okay, sure. Okay.
And then Patrick as well. So in some of the R1C districts as well, we still have those 25-foot wide lots that would fall under that 4,000 square foot minimum, and so they're considered substandard lots of record. And that piece is still in the code as well. So there's those two components.
Thanks.
And then we also have Marissa is now available. She's got her speaker working. So we're going to hear from Marissa and then Ben.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. My question was on the PUD part, and under section 3, the amenities waived for affordable infill of residential development. I thought we had talked about that a long time ago. And I was just curious if it had been changed from what we had talked about, or I thought that it was something that wasn't really supported by city staff either.
So Marissa, you're correct. So when we reviewed module 1, it came up. We said, nope, we are not supportive of that. But as Don had said early on, the way that the project has been scoped, we don't make amendments to module 1 2 or 3 until the very end, because if you make changes in module 3, it could impact module 1. So you're going to see that change occur in the consolidated plan. So hold tight. It will happen, I promise.
Okay, thank you.
Let's just wait for another 30 seconds or a minute, see if anybody else has a thought that occurs to them. Otherwise, we can spend some of this time providing some answers to some of the less complicated or simpler questions that have come in, just to share that information with people. But most important is make sure we've heard what everybody who is prepared to say something today has had a chance to do so.
Okay, so I do have a question that has come from Chris. So his question is in regard to the conversion map. It appears to be the sort of one-to-one conversion where the new zones are just transfers of the old zones into their new names, but essentially staying the same zone with new standards. Are there areas that are being rezoned or that will be zoned differently than they currently are? I'm interpreting the conversion, or is he interpreting the conversion incorrectly? And Deanna and Lena were our conversion specialists. So I'm going to go ahead and let them talk about exactly how that was done. But yes, you are correct. And then after we hear that, I'd like to hear from Drew, and then we also have Ben.
Yeah, and I think Andrea, this is Deanna, everyone. Thanks, Chris, for that question. I think Andrea really summed it up. Yes, we are just trying to do a straight transfer to the most applicable zone. So there's no rezoning happen. It's whatever's the most similar. We're working through some glitches because, and Don can even touch on this, there's not a perfect one-to-one for the MX mixed use street and mixed use activity center, but almost every other zone is a one-to-one transfer.
And I think, you'll hear a follow-up question from Ben regarding that too. He put that in writing, but he wanted to follow up and make sure that conversation happened today. So you'll hear from him shortly as well.
And I want to be very clear for people just real quickly. It's not that we don't recommend that happen, but it's a much cleaner process when the conversion map is as close to a one-to-one as you can make it, so that the focus stays on these rules, because we want the toolbox to be right. If you want to change the lines and say that shouldn't be MXN, that should be something MX, should be another MX district, that's a map debate. And it's very hard to debate the content of the rules and the map at the same time. So the most successful approach we've seen has been use the conversion map one-to-one, talk about whether the tools apply well as shown on the conversion map. If not, talk about whether the rules need to be changed in order to work that way. And then if adopt the code. And then if you want to, and the plan calls for quote unquote up zoning or down zoning or fixing of historic mistakes, do that as a separate thing so that the discussion about the debate about the map does not get tangled up with the debate about the code itself.
All right, how about Drew, followed by Ben?
Thanks. I had a chance to attend the meeting at the library this past weekend. That one was dual focused on housing and the rewrite. My only comment is good job. I think the city is doing a really tremendous job with this latest round of meetings, engaging the community. It was well attended. The use of technology was really helpful for having conversation, asking questions. Staff was there, council representation was there. So if anything, this is just a minute for me to say, good job. Well done.
Thanks, Drew. All right, Ben, do you want to go ahead and visit with us a little bit, then followed by Richard?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you, Andrea. It's a good segue coming off of Dawn and Chris's question on the one-to-one zoning. I just wanted to update the group on a conversation I had with Lena, Andrea, and Deanna earlier this week. And I did want to just elaborate a little bit on that question. I think there is a one-to-one in almost every circumstance, and one exception is the C2 zone. And if you're not familiar with the commercial zones in Boise, C2 is the predominant commercial zone up and down our thoroughfares, Broadway, Fairview, Vista, et cetera, State Street. And in the C2 zone, it gets split between the MXA and the MXS. And there's some things that are more desirable about MXA and some things that are more desirable about MXS. One has a maximum setback, one has a higher height limit, but they are very different, in my opinion, from a commercial development standpoint. And so I had a call earlier this week, very thankful for their time to walk me through the process of how those got converted on the map. And I would say that there's still some work to be done. I wanted the committee to know about that conversation and my opinion on that. The MXA zones, as it's called out in the blueprint, or sorry, in module 1, are for more medium intensity zones, closer to transit and a little bit more difficult to develop in some ways. In module 1, it says they'd be 1/8 of a mile from kind of major intersections. But as Deanna and Lena explained to me, there was some difficulty in doing that in the current map. And so I think a good way to describe it, the situation, is using an example. At the intersection of Broadway and Boise Avenue, Garfield Elementary School on one corner and the New Look Car Wash on another corner, and then 2 office buildings on the west side. That's an activity center in Blueprint Boise. And so, and also I guess a major intersection. So the MXA, according to module 1, would be 1/8 of a mile from that intersection. But using the old zoning map, as we know, they're big polygons. If you click on a C2 zone, it's some weird shape up and down Broadway. So the way that it was done in the conversion map was basically for a mile south of Boise Avenue as MXA, and for a mile plus north of Boise Avenue as MXS. So I just think the committee needs to be aware that I think more work needs to be done on this. I could see landowners in Boise, if you have and I like the mixed use zones, I just want to put that on the record. I think it's a great, I think it's a good transition in the ordinance. But if you're an LO property owner, you're an MXN owner after the conversion. That's straightforward. It's very objective. But the MXA, MXS, I think requires more conversation so that some owner who gets swapped over to MXA and his neighbor across the street as MXS doesn't get upset with the city.
Yeah, and if I was not involved in the calls earlier today because the conversion map has really been a city staff effort, which is as it should be. But I would, your comments are very thoughtful, Ben, and that's exactly right. The processes we've seen that work most successfully is when there is much one-to-one as possible. And when it's not, there's an objective reason or a good rationale for it that has nothing to do with somebody's influence with the city or somebody's amount of property they own or the size of the property owned. So again, I cannot predict, and I don't want to suggest that I know how it'll turn out in Boise. I will say in general, as long as you get to the end of this process and it appears that there were rational reasons for the judgments you made, and there were consistent reasons for the judgments you made as to how to parse things like MXS and MXA, you create the impression that this has been a fair process. If people disagree, they can disagree. But in general, map conversion takes a little bit of judgment. As long as it appears to have been fair and not influenced by favoritism in any way, usually those things become easy. You know, in the end, they're accepted. The map is refined several times. There are straightforward answers to the lines and the reasons why you do the lines. And people can accept that that is a fair thing for the city to do.
That's good. And then I'm following along in the chat, and Kelly Tagg has noted that she also caught on to the C2 zone. And then I have a question from Shellen that says, Don, when you say up zone or down zone as a second step, is that the property owners, or does the city do that? And then I guess before Don answers, we've talked about that internally a little bit, and it could be either one, but those processes are separate from the zoning code rewrite. So whether we complete the rezone process and just do those conversions one-to-one and making sure that we have those methods that are both fair and utilized equitably across the board. After that process is complete, then we have a couple of options before us. The city could do a citywide rezone, go in and clean up those areas where it just doesn't make sense. Or private property owners could come in and make those rezone requests as well. That will be a conversation for the city's leadership team to determine, do we have the resources to do that? Do we have the staffing to do that? And so that will continue to move forward once the process is over. But hopefully that answers your question. And then I also have, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and sometimes it's a combination of the two. I think Andrea's described it very well. I think what we would recommend, if the city has the resources and the time and the willingness to do it, is to propose after the code is adopted as a separate step. Often it happens between 6 months or 3 months and a year after, so people have time to catch their breath a little bit and realize that the focus is shifting. And to propose what they think would be a zoning map that includes the changes that are called for in Blueprint Boise, and to suggest that and to move forward with that. And I will be very honest with you, often what happens in that process is that the vast majority of those things are accepted as fair. That is the fair interpretation of what our plan says. There's no significant opposition to doing that. And then there are some where there are. Yes, I agree that Blueprint Boise says that, but I don't want it to happen in this area. Or I don't agree that that is what Blueprint Boise says ought to happen here. And sometimes those properties are taken out of a city-run upzoning process or rezoning or downzoning, whatever it is, but the city map amendment process, so that you get most of them done through a thoughtful process that tries to align the map with your plan to the greatest degree possible. And it's never perfect. There are always things that are going to really gum things up, and there are people who are willing to lie down in front of the bulldozers to prevent that particular property from being zoned in that particular way for some reason. And the city says, okay, we'll take it out of the process and learn to talk about that one another day, but we're not going to hold the whole thing up because of that. So.
All right, so we have a number of people. So we're going to start with Richard, followed by Francis, and then Kelly.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, my internet's been a bit spotty. I didn't hear everything that Marissa Keith was saying, but I think I was agreeing with her. And also I was just briefly kind of wondering if we really should be calling those good ideas, those environmental kinds of improvements as amenities. I think that might be a problem to try to lump those in and discuss and suggest that they're amenities, because they're really something else. And then as I was talking to people, very quickly, people start talking about parking. It's something that I personally, have kind of depending where we are. I'm often a fan of less parking, but it really depends so much. It's very site specific. And as I was talking to a very well-known planner, I won't mention who this was, but and some other neighborhood leaders, the discussion very quickly got into talking about overlays and how it would make sense to add this site-specific information specifically about parking onto the code in some way. And then from there, it went to, well, if we really want to implement and codify Blueprint Boise, the most site-specific and the part of Blueprint Boise that's had the most input from residents, from people who live here, often the products of hundreds and hundreds of hours, surveys, participatory events, are the neighborhood plans, which still really are not anywhere to be seen in what we're doing. And then somebody just came up with this idea of saying, every neighborhood plan should create an overlay. The North End has their overlay with the historic district, which is very close to a neighborhood plan overlay in a lot of ways. We have Sycamore having an overlay, Harris Ranch and all, they're essentially outside our efforts because they essentially have their own, they've been granted some power to have these site-specific plans essentially for them. And I thought, that's really, to me, that's where we should be going right now. I know that there's this idea that, having everything very simple is good in some way. But to me, what we're doing is not simple, actually, because as we take information away from a map, as we reduce the number of zones, that actually doesn't, in my mind, create a more simple process down the road. It creates a more complicated process because we no longer have the discerning ability to make decisions based on actual on the ground facts and on the ground just specificities. So I think, for me to now talk about, the specifics about Module 2, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense where we're going. I think that we need to step back and see how we can really incorporate neighborhood plans and really site-specific information, and rather than getting too carried away with creating, kind of a zoning template that you could apply to a lot of cities, but doesn't really necessarily say much about Boise. So that's where I am really kind of stepping back. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. Francis, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. The question I had was on page 79, talking about sensitive lands and in particular, the setbacks that are stated. Are those carried over from the original zoning plan? And so that's one question. The second question is, who is responsible for identifying the distance of those setbacks? And if people want to see that changed, increased, is attending a zoning, public engagement session the place to bring that up, or is there a different avenue that they should be looking at?
So as far as feedback goes, I guess I would welcome comments in any form. So whether it's at a community engagement event, whether it's an email, whether it's included in an upcoming survey, which will be released on February 24th. So be watching for that. We'll let you know when that happens, but there are a number of ways to do that. I believe that the sensitive lands setbacks did transfer directly. That would require me to do a little bit of research, and I can certainly do that and get back to you here momentarily. But I believe that most of those dimensional standards for sensitive lands were actually carried over.
I think that's accurate. I've been scrolling through them, and if they weren't, we would have footnoted them, and I'm not seeing footnotes saying that we changed them, and I can't remember anybody asking us to change them. And so I think they were carried over.
Yeah, and the sensitive lands piece has been a relatively successful piece. We haven't heard a lot of concerns regarding that, stating that we need to reevaluate those standards at this time. So unless we hear something, I'm comfortable saying that those stayed the same.
Okay, thank you for that. And if people would like to see some changes, is it planning and zoning that would make those changes, or is the Department of Fish and Wildlife? I mean, who is it that individuals would want to speak directly to?
Well, that's really going to depend what that is. So if it's a portion of the zoning code that says, our sensitive lands should be this, that is most certainly the city of Boise. And so P&Z would be making that recommendation and then council making that final determination. Now, if there are a number of like influence areas. So we've got like an airport influence area. We've got FEMA that makes distinctions on floodplains. If we're into those categories, the FAA would be in control of the airport influence areas and some of that criteria. The FEMA would be responsible for the designation of those floodplains and floodways. So it's really going to depend on what exact material we're looking for.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, Kelly.
Hello. So my question, it really piggies back on the conversation of the C2 zoning. And then I'm also looking at the PC zoning, particularly in my neighborhood, along the State Street corridor and Main Street. So all of the areas that were zoned PC are now listed as MXA. But well, first of all, on the zoning definitions, PC would fall over under MXN. So I'm curious as to why the PC zoning, at least in the area around our neighborhood, in the West Downtown area, it's all MXA. And I mean, to me, it seems like, we worked really hard to get the PC zone. We just put it in, and now the first thing that it does is go back to pretty much allowing the things that we worked really hard to not have allowed in the PC zone. So I want to understand why those in particular were chosen to be MXA.
I could try to get crack at it. It's
your question. Don, I think I can do it. I think, Kelly, that one I know specifically there was a weird glitch in the map. So I'm going to double check that actually got activated, because you're right. If it's currently PC, it goes to MXN, and that's the rule. So I want to double check that map issue. But if that is showing up as PC to MXA, that was a map issue.
Oh, okay, good.
Not
Thanks
a
for
rule.
talking.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I know
so
what you're talking about.
Okay, so let's definitely confirm that, because honestly, because in the C2 area of our neighborhood, that is now it's MXA. So then would that go to MXN, or would that go to MX, or would it go to MXN, or would it go to MXA?
So the C2 right now, as it's mapped near West Downtown, is mostly MXA, because there is a activity center there. And this is where I think with Ben, he brought up a great point. We still need to refine this map. And that's why it's a draft. So that's a great point, and we're glad we're getting this.
Yeah, because see, so maybe you and I could talk about it another time, because there's some very specific blocks where they're all surrounded by PC and RO, but there's just a few blocks that are C2. And now that whole area has gone from RO and C2 and PC to MXA. And so I think a portion of it makes sense because it's close to the activity center for it to be MXA. But there's like this little pocket of C2 zoning that was in our neighborhood that we're actually hoping to get more like to be like an RO or something like that. And so maybe MXN would make more sense.
And that's where I think to Don's point, we're trying to get away from the this rule and this rule, and we want to have like a clear transition, like conversion that we could speak to. And then later on, when we want to have more of a rezone process, we could go through those like uniquely refining. But I do think we need to have a clearer rule about when it goes from C2 to MXA, or when it goes from C2 to MX Street. And so we're working, I think this is all good feedback, but I know your specific one about PC, when you click on the parcel, it will say PC to MXN. It's just, I think the label shows as A. So that one I've been working on that. We could talk about this and I'll show it
Okay,
to you.
yeah, let's talk about this another, because it is really specific. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Andrea, this is Don. I just noting the time. I see we probably have some more hands up here that we may want to call on, but we at some point pretty soon we need to kind of move on to the modular
Yes.
organization.
So we haven't heard from Shellen quite yet, and she's got her hand raised. So let's go ahead and hear from Shellen. And then if we have time afterwards, we can always come back and revisit this. But we do have some other important information we'd like to provide to you too. So Shellen, go ahead and take the floor.
Oh, thanks. And you can just punt this if you want. But before I spend time going through, I mean, I have spent time going through and making some written comments, and I'm happy to submit those. But I wanted to understand, and I think I understand where you guys are going. I guess I just want to make sure. It seems like in a lot of places in Boise currently, and based on the conversion map, there's a lot of R1 that's directly adjacent to MXA or MXS. And I understand that's how it maybe converts, but my question is that what we intend to do? Because that seems difficult. Like it seems hard to have R1 next to mixed use. And I realize there's neighborhood protections in the code that sort of are intended to address that, but it also seems like we're really missing the opportunity to create transition areas along some of those more commercial or mixed use oriented zones that would create sort of a natural buffer when or if they're ever developed. And I guess I just wonder at a high level if I should if that's just for the next step that Don mentioned earlier, or if that's something that, we know that we haven't done a good job of in the existing zoning, and we can try to convert in this process, or is that just a no? It's okay either way. I just want to know how to look at it.
My thought, Shellen, would be put it in writing. It's because you kind of like some of these other questions. We could view it as a mapping conversion question in the future, or we could also, I think what you're really saying is, are we missing a zone district? Are we missing something that deserves to be on those boundaries? And that would be a question. It's really related to module 1. Did we get the menu right? And so I would go ahead and put it in writing now, is the short answer.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, it looks like everybody has had an opportunity that had their hand up. So let's go ahead and move on. I think actually we have scheduled our break. So if anybody needs to get up and wiggle around, they're welcome to do that. We just have a very short 5-minute break. So if everybody could come back about 3:47, and then we'll pick up and really start into that timeline for module 3 and some of those administrative documents.
Great, thanks.
All right, it looks like it is 3:47. And so let's go ahead and get started and give an introduction to Module 3.
All right, Dawn, if you want to move forward, I will get us started. So just a reminder of where we're at in the process. So we are in February, and we do have the next few months to go through some of the more specific topics and details of Module 3, which is administration and procedures. And that will be going on while the Module 2 outreach events are happening. And so we'll kind of be doing both for the next few months. And we plan to have Module 3 released in May, and then we'll start the outreach for that. Next slide, please. All right, so kind of zooming back out to the full overall structure of the code. So Module 2 was those development and design standards. Module 1 was zoning districts and use regulations. And so now we are in Module 3, which covers the general provisions of the code and then the administration and procedures. Next slide, please. All right, so specifically the table of contents for Module 3, just so you guys can get an idea of the topics that are covered in these. First is general provisions, and this sets up the code for the authority, the purpose of the code, the effective date of the code, its relationship to other laws, its relationship to the comprehensive plan, to covenants, how legally it transitions from prior versions of the code. And then if you go to the next, and then in administration and procedures, we start with the general purpose. Then there is another large summary table that shows you which development review processes require public notice, require neighborhood meetings, and who makes the decision, if it's staff, if it's a recommendation, and also which decision-making body can appeal things. And then the specifics of the responsibilities of each of the review and decision-making bodies. So that's things like Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council. And then we have general procedures, and Dawn's going to get into more detail about sort of the basics of each of these things. But general procedures apply to any procedure. And then the specific procedures are this sort of what you would apply for. So the conditional use permits, the subdivisions, that sort of thing. And then it ends with non-conformities and violations, enforcement, and penalties. Next slide, please. So if you all remember, way back when, Fields, we have our diagnostic report, which has really informed a lot of the recommendations we've been making throughout the modules. So just a reminder of what we heard when we did the initial outreach for the diagnostic report. There was a perceived lack of predictability and consistency throughout the processes in general, especially ones that overlap. There was a lot of confusion and misinformation about neighborhood meeting requirements. Along with that, the general need for overall more transparent, efficient, and objective review processes. And then specifically a lot of comments about refining the design review process, as well as clarifying the responsibilities of the design review committee. Next slide, please. Recommendations from the diagnostic report include reorganizing and relocating procedural standards into one chapter, simplifying some of the waiver and adjustment provisions so that there are less variance requests so that it can increase predictability among developments and among the same type of applications, to strengthen the general decision-making criteria Also to increase predictability as well as clarity and transparency. And then also to use more graphics and flowcharts to make the information more digestible for code users. Next slide. Now I'll pass it off to Dawn to talk about the basic elements and trends of procedures.
All right, and we'll just go through kind of where, once again, I'll say it many times. First of all, we're moving on to module 3. That does not mean any doors are closed with comments on module 2. As a matter of fact, we hope and expect to get many more comments from many of you regarding that. And I want everybody to understand they are always welcome. We need to move our focus on and then collect those and then digest the module 2 comments, but we have to move the thought process on into how this fits with how the city does business. So, and I would say one thing, in the diagnostic report that Gabby just reviewed, we've heard 2 things. At the time of the diagnostic report, we did hear a number of comments that people were frustrated with the design review process. Along the way, in the last 2 years, as that's come up, it occurs to me that we're hearing less of that. And we're hearing more people say, well, actually, I don't have a problem. If you can clarify things, that would be good. But I want to acknowledge that in at least that one area, what we heard 2 years ago or more appears based on conversations of this group and things we've heard since then to perhaps not be as true as we thought it was a while ago. So I want to acknowledge things change. Sometimes the things we write in the diagnostic report don't turn out to be exactly what we ought to be focusing on. So general provisions, if you recall, this is the first chapter. This is the introduction to the entire code. And I want to talk again, I want to repeat a little bit about this. Gabby mentioned it's basic, the legal authority, citing the authority in Boise law or other provisions that gives the city the authority to regulate in these areas and any limits on those powers to regulate. The other thing that is very key to clarify, which many codes do not do a good job of clarifying, is what happens when what happens when you got regulations of the city of Boise in your left hand and you got federal law in your right hand, or you have state law in your right hand. And how do you relate which one prevails? That is usually not a one-word answer. I will say this, often when you run up against the federal government, you lose. There is usually a source of power that has been given in one way or another through some aspect of law to the federal government. It is rare to find cases where the federal government asserts authority that it in fact does not have. But in cases of state law, it's harder to parse. There are areas where the state law has said, hey, we supersede what the cities in our state might want to do. And there are areas where they say we hereby defer to the cities and the counties in our state for what they want to do. So that needs to be clarified. It's very helpful to the public. Private covenants is an area where there is often a lot of confusion. And the basic rule in most communities is the city is not obligated to enforce any private covenants unless it's a party to that covenant, which is very rare. Sometimes if there's a historic preservation provision or something, the city wants to be a party so it can enforce the covenant. But in terms of private HOAs and residential covenants, usually the cities are not a party. They are between the people who bought the lots and the developer who wrote the covenants and the HOA, and the city's not a party to it. And usually this chapter clarifies that the city is not going to be enforcing those covenants. They are private contracts that the city is not enforcing. In addition, it usually clarifies, and this is all background just for everybody to understand how it usually works, could be different in Boise. The city is not obligated to zone consistently with covenants. And the reason that is kind of high level. Covenants are a private contract between a developer, an HOA, and the residents of a community. And that can't bind the elected officials of the community to not make laws in the public interest that they think they need to make. And so in most communities, covenants are in your left hand and the enforcement of them, the content of them was not drafted by the city. The enforcement of them is not up to the city, but they don't tie the hands of city council as to what they want to approve for the public health, safety, and welfare. They hold those powers from the state government. The state government does not say they have to be consistent with covenants because that's private lawmaking. And so basically it clarifies that for people who are not clear. And many, in my experience, many people are very unclear about that. And then this transition. The short answer, and I saw some chat about this, the normal transition is that anybody who has a permit or approval under the prior ordinances and regulations gets to keep it. Anybody, usually it says, anybody who has filed a complete application with the supporting materials before the date on which this new ordinance comes into effect has a right to be reviewed and approved under the prior ordinance. Until this code is the law, the current code is the law. And therefore you have a right to rely on approvals based on current law until the new law is adopted and put into effect by council. Now, we often get questions early in the process that say, wow, won't everybody want to be rushing in to get their applications in under the old law? You have a problem? And the answer is usually no. Actually, if we do our job well, people will be saying, I'm holding off filing my application until the new law comes into effect. It's actually better. I don't want to rush. Please, can you get the new one into effect? I'm not just saying that because I think we do a good job or you do a good job. It's usually the truth. We don't have people trying to throw applications in at the last minute because they actually prefer the law that is in effect prior to their application. So that's basically that is what this chapter does. I do want to go into show you, I'm sorry, now I'm moving on to, and there are really no trends in that area. In many of these areas, I'm going to give you a slide on basics and then where it's headed. That's kind of the introduction to the whole code. There are not a lot of trends in that except clarity, trying to answer as many questions up front that you're going to get over and over again about how this was done, why it was done, what's the authority to do it, how are we going to operate it fairly. Now, common procedures. Gabby mentioned this. We generally organize the procedural parts of how the city does business into two parts, two substantive parts. We're skipping over some of the descriptions of who is the Planning and Zoning Commission, who is City Council, who is the Design Review Committee. That's written down. Those are pretty straightforward. In common procedures, it's things you don't want to have to repeat over and over again. Like, how do we give notice? How do we hold public hearings? What do you have to file for a complete application? You don't want to have to repeat that over and over again because it makes the code very long. And so the common procedures is an area where basically you say, you know, if we're going to, everybody has to pay the application fee. Say it once, and it applies throughout the code. When we do a hearing, we do public notice like this. And if that varies for a particular type of approval, for example, sometimes there's a different notice procedure for a variance or for a historic preservation designation. Well, we'll say that later on, or we'll clarify it here, but it's in one place. So in the table of contents, you see public notice, and the answer is, okay, that's where I learned how they do public notice. You just don't want to repeat this stuff. The more you repeat things, the more in the future someone will amend chapter 7 and forget to amend chapter 6 or subsection 6, which actually says the same thing and is supposed to operate the same way. But we just forgot. We were focused on subsection 7 and we forgot to fix subsection 6. So don't repeat it if you don't need to. And finally, again, the same thing at the bottom bullet there. So I'm going to go to the next thing here. Often, right at the beginning of this is a summary table, and this is just the top line of it, but this is what you can expect to see when Module 3 is released in May. Down the left-hand side, this is the first rows of a table. Down the left-hand side are all of the different application types that you could make to the City of Boise. The next column over is a cross-referenced hyperlink. So if it says annexation and you're thinking about an annexation, you click on that and it takes you straight to the section that tells you how annexations work, or conditional use permit, or variance. 3 columns to talk about different types of public notice. We have actually carved this out of a code, but sometimes there's a 4th column called web notice. Just if cities want to write down, we will give web notice even when we're not required to give other kinds of notice, or we don't want to do mail notice. It's too expensive. We can't do it for minor things, but we will do web notice. So that public notice section of the table often has a 4th column. Pre-submittal activities. Do you need to go talk to the staff about this before you file an application? Increasingly, for major applications or complex ones, cities do require this because they don't want people spending a lot of time and money when the idea they're trying to write up and submit has no chance of complying with the law. And they don't even know that and there's no real way to get that approved except in a very complicated rezoning. The point is, if that's true, you need to find it before you spend a lot of money. So is there a pre-submittal meeting? Do you need to have a design review committee meeting? Do you have to have a neighborhood meeting? These are, and again, these are tailored for each community. So we've written codes where there are more types of meetings. But on the columns, on the rows of this table below these columns, you check mark. Yes, you need published, mailed, and posted notice, or you need published and posted, but in this case, you don't need mailed notice. Yes, you need a pre-submittal meeting, but you don't need a neighborhood meeting. Yes, you do need a neighborhood meeting, but you don't need the other types of meetings. You check box so that everybody understands what the things leading up to this action are going to be. And then the right-hand columns are usually filled in with, as you can see, an R if that group reviews, a D if they make the decision, an A if they hear the appeal. And then there's some sort of a symbol, a bracket, or an asterisk that says, in this case, they're going to hold a public hearing. We have some increasingly in recent years added another legend that says there's a public meeting on this after the application. It's not a pre-meeting with the neighborhood, but there's a meeting. We want to make this available to the public so that we can educate and know what they want to hear, but it's not a public hearing. And some city attorneys want to be very clear. Public hearings have to be conducted in accordance with quasi-judicial law. You have to make a record. You sometimes have to allow cross-examination. You have to allow testimony on the record. You have to verify that the person who's speaking has standing to speak. And there are increasingly cases where cities want to allow a public meeting. They want to hear from the public, but they do not want to have people challenging them later because it wasn't a formal public hearing. And the answer was, well, it was never intended to be a decision on the record or creation of a record. This was an informal, smaller decision. We wanted to hear from people. We did not want to hold a hearing. So that may be an addition we do. But anyway, moving down below this table, you will see this table in the draft. Moving down below the table, very commonly these days, you don't put the details of every type of study or document you have to file for an application in the ordinance. They are moved to an administrative document maintained on the city's website. Some cities say the city council has to approve that. Some say they don't have to. Some say, no, that's up to the planning director and the public works and the engineering. We hire professionals. They know what they need for these types of applications. We do not need to be approving every change. That's a local choice. But the point is, of the people who read this ordinance, only 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 or 1 in 30 is actually going to want to fill out an application and do it. So putting in long lists of a drawing at the following scale or 4 copies of an electronic file at the following format is not very helpful, because 9 out of 10 people don't need to know that, and it just makes the code longer and harder to read. So we generally recommend strongly that that be moved out to a website, where it can be uploaded, and engineers know where to find it. And the floodplain guys know where to find it. The stormwater guys know where to find it. The road guys know where to find it. The people who are applying for a conditional use permit can easily find it just as easily as they can find it in the code. But those who are not going to file an application don't have to read through those long lists of things that they have to be submitted. So, and again, often one of the things that you talk about a lot in this module is public notice requirements. And I think I have mentioned earlier in these meetings, there is a trend around the country to say, we may want to move to giving public notice to folks, even if a public hearing is not required. Well, won't they get angry? They got notice, but it turns out the guy has a right to do this and they can't stop it. That's just in most communities decide that's just a bridge you have to cross. The concept that we only notify you when there's a hearing and you can express your ability, and some decision maker can say, well, I don't want to approve this, is a convention. It's a convention that we've inherited over 50 years, but it's not a logical connection. And more cities are saying, with electronic notice, we can tell the public every time an application's filed. We can tell them all kinds of things that they would like to know, even if that sign that the guy's going to put on the corner is legal and there's no way to stop it because it's a legal sign. Knowing it's going to happen before it happens is not a bad thing. People get surprised less often. They're upset less often. They can follow it up. Does he really have the right to do this? Well, Yes, he does, if it's only 8 feet tall, but if he wanted to make it taller than 8 feet, he'd have to get some sort of a hearing. Just knowing that so people can follow on and say, let me ask some questions about this, usually is a good thing. And neighborhoods get quickly over the fact that every time you get a notice, it means that there's going to be a public hearing. They're, in our experience, appreciative of the fact that the city is notifying them more often about more things, even though they are not discretionary decisions. So those are trends. In addition, often we try to consolidate the different paths towards approval into fewer categories. I will stand by my comments earlier that micro-managed categories and micro-managed uses and micro-divided zone districts are in general not a favor to the public. It makes things harder to understand and govern. We do often include administrative adjustments, which are small amounts of deviation from setbacks or lot coverage or parking that can be approved by administration through the process of reviewing an application without a public hearing, without a public showing of hardship. Boise may not want to do that. I've worked with communities like Indianapolis that talked about it for a long time and then in the end said, nah, we're not going to do that. But the majority, the vast majority of communities do this these days to say, and the reason is, if the site is trapezoidal, it is a weird site, and I can meet all the setbacks but one, and that is because there's an easement running through the property. The property falls off into a ditch and I can't do anything about it, whatever it is. There are, in many newer codes, a common procedure that says the staff, the planning director, in the course of reviewing a site plan can say, if you show them a reason that you did not create for 1 lot or 2 lots or maybe 3 lots, but not more than that, there's a unique situation on the face of the earth here. And the best you can do is this, and it's a 10% reduction in the setback for the following reasons. Staff is allowed to approve that to allow the project to move forward. That is a trend that is pretty clear around the country. It's very clear in recent codes, but it is not something you need to do. Often, trend includes having to submit a concept plan, a general layout showing how the roads are going to connect, how the utilities are going to connect, the open spaces, the habitat, how the sensitive land protections are going to align with your neighbors, so that you don't wind up with just commercial sites that are padded out to individual sites that have no connection to each other, or open space that has no connection to the open space on your neighbor's property. So that is a trend to say, look, if you're doing a fairly large thing that is going to be probably parceled out to multiple developers, multiple landowners, we need a plan up front to see how it's going to fit together before we get into individual types of site approvals. One of the big things we spend time on is more objective decision-making criteria. I've said it before, I kind of feel this might be an uphill struggle. More words do not make better decisions. More criteria do not make better decisions. Clearer criteria make better decisions. Decisions that a planning commissioner or a design review committee member and the public and the staff can all understand what it means, and they come to the same understanding of what it means. That's what makes better decisions. And so listing 21 boxes that need to be checked, in our experience, does not make a better decision. It increases the chances that you can't possibly check box 17 and box 10 and box 2 on the same parcel. It can't be done. And so you end up trying to say, well, I don't think they met the criteria. Well, I think they did. So we often end up spending quite a bit of time on this, even though it's kind of one of the unsexy corners of zoning, to try to say, how clear can we be so that everybody has a common understanding of how they're going to make this decision in this particular case. And then often appeals need to be reviewed in terms of the fact that do you have multiple rounds of appeal, which most cities want to avoid. If a decision's been made and it needs to be appealed, fine. But you don't want to set up situations where appeals are used just to delay properties, or just on anybody's part, or it's been denied, but the developer appeals it because they really want to go ahead with the property. And the citizens say, wait, we got a denial, we win. Guy says, nah, you don't win. I'm taking you up on appeal. So the point is, it can go either way, but most communities want to clarify and simplify and be very clear about how appeals happen. And in many cases, they want one appeal on a particular development approval, not multiple appeals, which increases the chances that regardless of which side of the decision you're on, increases the chances that this is being used to delay or hope that the other party runs out of patience or money in the process. Specific procedures. I'm moving on to basic procedures here. These are the basics. When you lay out, how do you get a variance? How do you get a rezoning? How do you get a conditional use permit? How do you get design review approval? There's a flow chart. They cross-reference. We don't repeat everything. We go back. If we talked about notice earlier, then you just cross-reference how notice is given. You can see 2 examples of flow charts here. They do not get into the detail of handing the application around inside the city. They're aimed at the public. Who files this? Who reviews it? What are the steps? Who makes the decision? I'm unhappy. Who do I appeal to? And in some of these examples, if I need to modify it afterwards, how do I modify it? And again, these specific procedures are where we try to be clear on the objective standards. Usually these are organized by decisions made by council, decisions made by design review, decisions made by planning and zoning, decisions made by Board of Appeals, decisions made by staff. Because the public can understand it easier if you organize these things kind of by how long the process is and how many opportunities for public engagement there are, rather than alphabetically or in some other way. So the trends is to try to integrate better the zoning and subdivision things. Often they were adopted originally in 2 different ordinances, even when they were unified. They often don't speak to each other very well. Many types of development require both a zoning approval and a subdivision approval. Well, how does that work? How complicated is it? How simple can we make it? How can we align them so that as planning and zoning or others are reviewing them, they're not getting whipsawed by the criteria for a subdivision and the criteria for a zoning approval. They are consistent or can be made consistent and understandable when both of those things are happening either at the same time or in close proximity to each other. We do the simpler flow. We try to simplify flow charts and be very clear. This is not the step-by-step inside the city. It's the view from outside. In the example on this slide, you'll see their gavels over at the right side. That often is an indication. It's an indication that there will be a public hearing on this, so the public citizens can look at this and say, I get it. I don't get to talk to the director about this. I mean, I can, but the director is not going to make the decision. Planning and zoning is going to review it, and there's a public hearing. Then city council does it, and there's a public hearing. Aligned with what I said earlier, often increasingly in newer codes, there's another symbol that says there'll be a public meeting on this, but there's not going to be a public hearing on this. Again, this is something that often requires quite a bit of discussion and comes out differently in every community. But in general, there is a trend around the country when you rewrite this module to say, how much of this, if we had better decision-making criteria and better workflows for thoughtfully considering this application, would we need to have a public hearing on this? And increasingly, there is a trend towards saying, with the new use specific standards, with the crisper decision-making criteria, with the updated parking standards, with the neighborhood protection provisions, we do not need a public hearing on this. Staff can make this decision and it can be appealed if someone's dissatisfied or they think that the use specific standards or the criteria have not been met. Yes, you can appeal it. And I have heard more than once in the last 10 years, oh, Don, thanks for writing it, but they'll appeal. I will appeal every one of them. They don't appeal every one of them. If it can be made by staff, often that is what is done in newer codes. I have had very few examples around the country of people saying, staff has been making these decisions, but we don't like that. We're going to send it up to a public hearing. That is very rare to see anybody say that. Increasingly, they're saying, we have some things where we go to a public hearing, but it's very clear that they meet the criteria in this ordinance. So the city attorney's nervous. It's not clear how we could modify or turn this down. We shouldn't be having a public hearing. Or if we want to have a public hearing, then the criteria have got to include something that includes a discretionary approval criteria, something clear, crisp, because as it is now, more cities than you would think send things into public hearing where the city attorney is sitting there crossing his fingers and saying, oh, I hope they don't turn this down because we have no legal basis to turn this down. So that's kind of trying to straighten things out. Finally, trying to acknowledge when can you get a variance and a conditional use at the same time? If you need more than one type of approval from the city, how can those be coordinated, or do they have to be done separately in separate sequential steps? Once again, some places like that, most places say no. The variance in the conditional use permit, or the variance in, I'm making this up, or the conditional use permit and the design review really are very connected to it. The acceptability of this is tied to both of those approvals, and we would like to not have them be bifurcated unless we have to have them be bifurcated. So, and then appeals provisions are clarified. I'm going to wind up pretty quickly here. Non-conformities, Gabby mentioned this. So I've had 2 slides on common procedures, 2 slides on specific procedures. Happy to take questions. Non-conformities, for those who aren't zoning geeks, and most people aren't, is things that were legal when they were created. The business was legal when it was created. The building was legal when it was created. The landscaping met the code when it was created. The sign was fine when it was created. But the city changed its rules, or the state came along and condemned the front of the property for a turn lane, and now it doesn't meet the criteria. Front setback is too short now. And so the point is, this property owner was legal and has operated legally and is now not in conformance with the rules because of something the government did or was out of their control. How do we handle them? And the short answer is trying to clearly convey in most communities, you may continue to operate that business and you may continue to use that building. And to say, the 3 basic questions are, and by the way, you may sell it to a new owner who will have the same rights you do. And you can lease it to a new owner who will have the same rights you do. Your rights do not expire. You had a legal business and a legal use, and you are allowed to sell it, and that can go on until somebody decides to change the use for the building. The 3 questions come up are, can I expand it? If I shut it down and it goes vacant for a period of time, can I restart it? And if it gets damaged by fire or flood, can I rebuild it? Those are the 3 things: basic expansion and restarting and rebuilding after damage. The question is, at what point should we say an event has happened and you didn't apply for redevelopment, but you've kind of lapsed your right to start this business, which for various reasons, or this building, which technically shouldn't be in that zone district in this form. And so the trends in this area are to loosen up on this. More and more cities are saying, look, the building was built. If we make the guy modify it, it's less sustainable. You're using energy, you're using materials, and those are jobs. So in general, but technically the code has to address how you treat people who unintentionally do not comply with your code. And the trend is to say, let them be. Do not make life hard on them. Let them continue unless this situation is really going to hurt public health or safety. And that means not welfare. I didn't say the 3rd word. That means this is a dangerous condition. The reason they're out of compliance is through a process that somebody is going to get hurt or worse if something goes wrong here. We changed the law for a reason that is really unsafe. And to narrow down the situations in which people are saying, yes, you can continue it, but if you abandon it and it's going to create public health and safety, you may not restart it. So that's the line, not technical nonconformance, but is this going to harm somebody? That is the line that increasingly codes are drawing. And then final chapter, violations, enforcement, and penalties. How will the city enforce this? And so the codes usually are much clearer about what is a violation of the code. Clearly, if you build a building that you didn't have a right to build, that's a violation of the code. You start a use that is illegal in that neighborhood, that's a violation of the code. If your approval had conditions on it and you don't obey those conditions on your approval, that's a violation of the code. But they're usually clearer. They go further than that. They say things like filing misleading information or fraudulent information on your application or failing to disclose things that had to be disclosed on your application and that you knew about are violations of the code. So you try to be very clear to help staff and help everybody understand the variety of things that could be considered violations. Failure to maintain the landscaping that you were required to install, or the buffering that was part of your site approval, is usually a violation of the code. And then to try to clarify the different steps the city can take to enforce it. In general, the trend here, and usually it's not written down, but increasingly newer codes write it down. The point of enforcing zoning is not to collect fines and force people to take things down. The point of enforcing zoning is to help people bring their properties back into compliance. You violated it, you did not maintain the landscaping. We're going to give you a letter. We're going to ask you to maintain the landscape, a polite letter saying, please replace the landscaping. You have a duty to do so pursuant to the following, followed by a little bit less polite letter saying, look, we've told you once, there's another 30 days, you need to do this. Followed by, all right, this is, if you don't do this by such and such a day, the fines are probably going to start kicking in, and here are what the fines are. And by the way, fines happen every day. Every day of a zoning violation is usually a separate fine. And so to give people an incentive to say, oh, I better pay attention now. Now, I'm only describing in general the trend. The trend is to say, let's be much clearer that our goal here is to give people lots of help and lots of chance to bring their properties into compliance rather than to punish people for non-compliance. That is usually spelled out much more in newer codes than it used to be in others. So we'll talk more about this in later meetings, all of this. But I will take a pause now. I think we're well along the way. And I guess I'll do this first of all. We have discussion at the end, so I'll just do about 3 more slides. Those are the trends. That's what you can expect to see. And I would love to have comments. I'm sure that some of you probably do not appreciate some of those trends, or hope that those trends don't wind up in the draft that we're doing. So I'd love to have conversation today or tomorrow or next month or the following month. But basically, I want to review, for those of you who haven't focused on it, in Boise today, what are the decision-making bodies and how are you organizing this part of your code today? So you can just read the list on the table. You know who these people, who these groups are. If you didn't know, now you know this. These are the various people who do things in the city. Hearing examiner is listed as in your code today, but it is not currently being used. You had a hearing examiner, the hearing examiner was not retained, but staff has been having questions, discussions about whether it should be reinstated for certain types of decisions. There are 2 ways you can do this, but often a hearing examiner is given authority to hear things like minor variances, instead of having the Planning and Zoning Commission hear things like that. Basically saying, look, this is a minor deal. We do need to hold a public hearing. We have an employee or a contractor who is going to conduct those public hearings and make decisions. And if you don't like it, you can appeal it. But again, the hearing examiner can often apply the code very consistently over time. And the issue is, you know, Planning and Zoning Commission is supposed to be using its judgment as to how to make decisions to drive the city forward. Minor variances, maybe in some cases minor appeals, are not things that are going to bend the curve of Boise going forward. They're just quasi-judicial decisions. What is the proper decision given the criteria and the state of the property? And so that is under discussion. We'd be happy to hear that. The cities that do it because it seems to save time and energy and help the other decision-making bodies focus on things that are of more strategic importance to the future of the city. So again, you now have already these types of review, and you can read this. I'm not going to read it to you. There are certain things that staff decides. There are certain things that Planning and Zoning decides, that City Council. You also have Design Review Committee, which is not on here. But this is going to be posted for the public, and you can kind of see the allocation of things. This chart is only on here to show you, in general, the module 3 comes down to a decision. Is this operational? Is this running the city according to the laws that it has already adopted? And the real question is, does it comply with the law? That's staff. Does it require discretion, but it is not at the level that it is going to alter the future of the city in some substantial way? That is an appointed body, whether it's historic preservation or planning and zoning or design review. and city council makes the decisions that are likely to affect the future course of the city. Amendments to the zoning ordinances, amendments to the zoning map, comprehensive plans, setting out the subdivision, the framework of roads and open spaces into which Boise will grow over time. So those are that kind of small, medium, large is the way these things are generally tried to be organized. And that's part of the exercise over the past several months. Are they categorized correctly? Is this the right breakdown of who should be making these decisions, or is there a different breakdown that would work better? Last slide. Usually, again, there is a table. You have one today. I showed you the top line of a newer one in the past, but you can see here, you already have this. You have the procedures, a little bit of a description. You have who makes the decision. This particular table does not include whether you need different types of public notice, and it doesn't include whether you need a meeting ahead of time. You'll notice that under conditional use permit here, you have a kind of an unusual number of different types of conditional use permits that have different procedures. We'll be talking about whether you need that many. So I'm just pointing out to you, you already have a version of this layout from when the code was reorganized but not updated some years ago. But it does not convey as much information as newer code would convey. So I am done, and we'll put these 3 questions up here. I see we have chat questions, several of them, so it's time for me to be quiet. And for Andrea to honcho this, we've put some suggested questions up here. We're talking process here. What have you heard? What have you heard about design review? What have you heard about public notices? And what would make this easier for you to understand? Andrea.
So we did have a couple of chats. So Richard noted that replacing public hearings with administrative decisions in Boise is terrible. I think of the Blue Valley decision by the director to hold no neighborhood meeting with residents for a 99-bay diesel truck terminal and fueling station within 150 feet of residential front doors. Unfortunately, here, some neighborhoods like Blue Valley are not treated equally with more powerful neighborhoods. Administrative decisions appear to reflect this geographic disparity in political power. And there are some things that we may want to note. So the director did not waive a neighborhood meeting. A neighborhood meeting was not required. And the unusual piece with that is Blue Valley was actually a non-conforming use in an industrial zone. So the industrial use did go to a public hearing. So all of those things were in place. Then we also have Byron, who noted that he is in favor of additional administrative approvals to accompany a well-written code, but clearly there are some high-impact uses that will continue to require public hearings, as Richard noted. Patrick Spouts noted that he agrees with Byron's comments above. So lots of good comments, but we want to hear from you. What have you heard about all of these public noticing or public hearing procedures? Do you have ideas on how it could be better? Those types of things. All right, Marissa, go ahead.
I think overall, notice works fine to those that fall within the radius. There's a lot of people that don't think the notice radius is large enough because, especially with these larger projects, it can affect much further away than just the 500 or 600 feet. But I think what people get confused about is when, and this doesn't happen all the time, it's happened a lot lately, but when hearings are kind of deferred and there's lots and lots of notices that build up, people, like, unless you know to go to the online PDS system and you can figure it out and access the stuff you need, it can be very difficult to find out what the timeline is. And so I think that's something that could be worked on. That's not really a code issue. That's more like the online PDS software issue. But I know there's a lot of people that you know, they get these hearing notices and I don't know, they just don't feel like the radius goes far enough, because it's very, when you look at it, you know, it's like, does it fall from the center of the property? Is it the property line of the property? And then you have people that are like across the street that don't get noticed, particularly in areas where there may be large parcels and not a lot of neighbors, and not a lot of people get noticed in those situations.
Andrew,
Go
ahead.
Go ahead. Kelly had some comments as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly share about the one thing that my neighbors and others have commented about is the neighborhood meetings themselves. It's really a mixed bag. Sometimes the developers are really interested in partnering with the neighborhood and addressing some of their concerns with the project, and may modify some of the design elements and so forth. But more often than not, it seems like the developers, it's something they have to check the box to say they did. And we've had meetings where a person who was not really qualified, it was like an assistant in the office, showed blueprints, and wasn't really able to answer questions properly. So it was kind of a bit of a waste of time. And if it really is just a check the box item to say, okay, you've got to notify the neighborhood about this project, then it doesn't seem like it really lends itself well to fruitful conversation. If the developer's not interested in the input from the neighborhood and they're going, to move forward with their design, then, I don't want to say why bother, because I think there should be a good dialogue, but it seems like at this point, there's not a lot of incentives for the developers to really take anything that the neighborhoods say seriously, So like I said, it's been a mixed bag, but some developers are great, but it's more often than not, they fall in category 2 where they're just checking the box.
That's good feedback. I just got a call about that earlier today. So
okay. Yeah.
Marissa, and then we will follow her by Esther.
One more comment. Something that we've noticed out here is that sometimes people who are renting houses or in apartments do not get the notices. It goes to the property owner. So that leaves like a whole class of people that are unaware of what's going on.
This is good information. We are supposed to be noticing both owners as well as occupants. So, Esther.
Hello. So to Kelly's point, I am the planning and zoning cost or neighborhood point person. And what I have found is that some developers, and really it's they're like architect folks, that will reach out to the neighborhood association about neighborhood meetings. And I can think of, in the last 3 years, I can maybe think of 2. But then we have other instances where, we had a proposal within our neighborhood, and I don't think I ever saw anything. And then some of these proposals, like we have one right now that's maybe, I think it's 11 or 12 townhomes right off Hill Road. And so that actually, and back to Marissa's point, there are some of these developments, they are, they're not just a localized impact to the immediate or the adjacent homeowners, but in this particular case, increased traffic on Hill Road when we have an increased use of bicyclists and pedestrians, I feel like that should, more, or there should be some consideration for notifying the neighborhood association so they can at least share that with those that are involved within those boundaries.
Andrea, if I could weigh in on a couple things.
Go ahead.
All right. No, these are great comments. These are fantastic comments, and they suggest follow-on comments from our experience. So the comments about checking the box are we've heard before too, and even though often it doesn't belong in the code, I think that because of this frustration, we are seeing more communities establish base rules for what the neighborhood meeting needs to do. And it's hard to do because, to be honest, the neighbors would really like to know all the details, and the developer does not know the details. And frankly, the developer is not supposed to know all the details at that point. Depending on the type of application that they're filing, it's very legitimate for them to say, well, I need to see if I get this approval or that approval before I hire an architect, before I hire an engineer. And so there is a kind of a fundamental difference of expectation in that area. But because of that, I think it's fair to say that we've had communities come up with administrative documents that say, when we require a public meeting, a neighborhood meeting, this is what you need to be presenting. And and sometimes requiring that one, or offering to both sides the ability to file a summary of the meeting, which provides with the application materials, so that it is part of the application. We've worked with a few communities that say, if you don't have a summary of the meeting, we assume it didn't actually take place. And so you need to file it, which actually makes it kind of, our general experience is people think, I don't know about the track record, that's going to result in better meetings, because if you show up and you're just checking the box and you say it all went well, they loved it, and you're at risk of the neighborhoods saying, we actually didn't tell us anything and we don't like it. You probably don't want to have both of those going in at the same time as part of your application materials. And so it leads to a greater taking it more seriously, because the bottom line is nobody has to file anything, but you would like to be able to file a summary or notes from the meeting or something about the meeting that is not in clear discrepancy with what someone else is likely to file about that meeting. So we've seen those terms. It does usually not belong in the code. It belongs in an administrative document. I want to talk, and let me talk about notice a little bit. We also have seen a trend where the notice radius sometimes changes based on the size or complexity of the project and the zone district. I've actually seen very large radiuses out in rural areas, because people say, well, you can say 500 feet or 1,000 feet, but nobody lives within that area. You could have notice to 0 people. And so because of the distance and the fact that it's raw land and it's in an annexed area, it's rural. And so the bottom line is, sometimes we see notices that are notice radius distances that are correlated to the size or complexity of the project, and or the number of people likely to live within that proximity of the application. So that can be tailored, just as relevant to the earlier conversation, parking requirements can be tailored to different areas of the city. Then let me mention one other thing, just so we get it out on the table. This is not something we can resolve today, but I would urge people to think about it. It's an emerging issue. And it relates to Richard's comments, which are always very thoughtful, and I respect them. Richard's comment was, if you make decisions administrative, you may be disempowering less advantaged or less engaged or less privileged neighborhoods who are not very connected to the city's governance. At least I think that's what you said. And even if you didn't say it, it is an argument that is often made, is that it's not working well for disadvantaged neighborhoods and populations here, and it's set up that way. The usual answer to that is the city needs to make extra efforts to get those less engaged and less advantaged neighborhoods to get more notice and show up more often and be more engaged. And that is a legitimate answer, and it may be exactly the answer that Boise comes up with through this process, is that the way to deal with the demographic or economic or racial or ethnic unfairness that are created is to make sure that you keep public hearings and you do a better job getting the right people to those public hearings. I will say the thing I'd like everybody to think about is the counter argument, which has come up in the last several years, is, hey, we've been trying to do that for a long time. Planners have not been trying to ignore disadvantaged neighborhoods. If anything, perhaps they pay more attention to those who get there, who write more often and show up at hearings more often. But internally in the department, they're well aware that some neighborhoods are not, and they've been trying to figure out how to get this done. It's not as if this is a bright idea. We know that some communities are unengaged. We've been trying. And the counter argument that's come up in a couple last few years is it may be fairer to make them administrative decisions, because staff will likely make the same decision regardless of who the application is or where it comes from. It is either it meets the criteria for an administrative decision or it doesn't. And so I am not putting my oar in the water. I'm respecting the comment that Richard made, and I think that comment and the usual answer, I guess I would endorse the usual answer is we are going to make better efforts. We are going to notify tenants. We're going to try to round up representatives and make sure that we are trying to strengthen the neighborhood organizations in the areas of the city that are less privileged. But there are, I've had this discussion twice in the last month with different cities over whether it is quote unquote fairer to keep public hearings, given the history that we have with public hearings, or fairer to not have them when you can come up with objective standards, because it is, it doesn't matter whether you can show up or you're working 2 jobs or you're retired or you're educated or less educated when it's a staff decision. It doesn't matter. It may matter as to whether that decision gets appealed, but it doesn't matter at the decision, because the decision is likely to be made the same way, regardless of who the application is, in terms of whether the application meets the code. So I expect that will result in some comments. It isn't something we can solve today, but I think in thinking this through, people should just dwell on that and scratch their heads as to of that issue, because it'll come up. I've raised it and it'll come up even if I hadn't raised it.
All right, Don, Andy has provided a comment and a question that ultimately says that land planning, the land planning process takes into consideration aspects that are controlled by outside agencies. This could include ACHD. How do we incorporate them in meaningful ways in this process? While agencies do comment on applications, how involved are those neighbors in those processes?
Well, my short answer is you have an unusual situation, as you all know, with ACHD. City is not in control of ACHD. ACHD has a very unusual degree of control over what happens in Boise, thanks to the way your government is set up. So I think there are kind of 2 questions here. In terms of how involved are the neighbors in ACHD, I actually don't know. My suspicion, and you guys please feel free to correct me, I'm sitting several hundred miles away from you. My suspicion is that neighbors are less aware of what ACHD does than they are of planning and zoning and design review and committees and things that are closer to home and that they identify with the city of Boise. So my guess is that they're not engaged in that. And again, the second level question is there anything Boise could do to help that? And other than turning comments that come, my guess is the city gets comments on development that clearly staff looks at and says, well, we agree, but we can't make that decision. It has to go to ACHD. Andrea, you can tell me, I don't know, do you forward those comments to ACHD? Because we really can't, to the best of my knowledge, control what ACHD does or the processes by which it makes those decisions.
No, we don't have, any formal way. I guess the most formal piece of the process is when an application is received, any applicable agency that may be impacted by them, we notice them and let them know that their comments should be received to us. Unfortunately, ACHD sometimes isn't very timely with their comments, so the city's public hearing may come before ACHD's. That happens quite frequently. Oftentimes our staff will have to call ACHD or ITD staff to see where they are in the process. Do they have concerns? Do they feel comfortable with us moving forward? So there isn't a whole lot that we can do other than make sure that they're getting the noticing in a timely way, making sure that they know when those comments are expected to be incorporated and considered in the final comment. But I don't know if there's anything else that we can do. And I don't know if we are truly the unusual circumstance, or if there's other practices that other jurisdictions use. I think we'd be open to any of those recommendations or suggestions.
Well, let me ask, I'm way out on a limb here because I'm sorry, go ahead. I think somebody was trying to speak and I spoke over them, so I apologize. Andrea, do you know if anybody was trying to speak?
I don't see anything. So if somebody has a comment, then they're welcome to provide it, after you give a suggestion to us.
So I'm way out on a limb here. I have not discussed this with staff at all, but you kind of ask a general question. How do we see bifurcated? What happens when there are bifurcated decision-making processes with different governmental entities? Yours, I think, I've never worked in a place where a county highway department has the kind of authority over transportation that ACHD has, and it's probably not the only one in the country, but I have not worked in a place that has that situation. However, there are many situations in which different branches or decision-making bodies in a city government have control over different parts of a development approval, like historic preservation and planning, like design review and planning. In some cases, like a variance and a planning approval or a zoning approval. And we have worked with communities that have come up with systems that say, when decisions involving the following types of bifurcated decisions, road access and a zoning approval, or road improvements, or road classification, and whether that's appropriate for this level of intensity. When that happens, we have set up systems in some places where there are joint meetings, where those things are conducted as joint meetings between the different bodies together. So you're not making the applicant go through two different processes with two different groups of people with two different moods on two different nights. But you're also not making the citizens show up twice to be told at the first meeting that that comment is really more relevant to the second meeting. And so I don't know if that's something, but you said, Andrew, you'll consider joint meetings over projects of a certain size or complexity that involve both road access or both two different decisions by ostensibly different groups. We've seen those systems, and we've also seen systems where in certain conditions, one decision-making group delegates its decision-making authority to another group. We have had, I believe, I'm trying to remember back, cases where, for example, the Planning Commission makes a decision, and there's also going to need to be a need for a variance. And the Board of Adjustment delegates its authority to make that decision to the Planning Commission, subject to its own criteria. So the Planning Commission is making a decision over something according to its criteria, and is also acting in that situation as the Board of Adjustment, making a decision about the variance according to variance criteria. I am not suggesting those, I'm offering them as ways in which other communities have said, we don't know the right answer, but we kind of feel like two different hearings before two different groups on related aspects of the same development is not the way we should be doing business.
All right, Drew has asked, is a map of active planning permit requests either available or something that could be considered? Is that a norm in other communities?
I can't answer the first part of the question. Increasingly, there's a trend in general around the country to give more notice upon the application of receipt of an application. Sometimes, and I don't think I recommend this separately, but sometimes a notice when the application is deemed complete and it's going to start approval process. Sometimes, obviously, notice of a public hearing if it's required. Sometimes notice that an administrative decision has been made in case you want to appeal it. So the types of notice, I know city staff is sweating now because the bad news is the trend in terms of workload, more notice at more points in the process. The good news is usually it's electronic, but so that they are relying. Yes, we know there's a digital divide. Nevertheless, faced with less notice or more notice, less notice, but it's all going out by the mail, and more notice, but it's going to be done electronically for budget reasons. The trend is to go with the latter. And so I do not know whether there's a map. I would assume there are, but I have not. So do you do a map, Andrea?
So no, we do not have an active map that would show the planning requests that are in process at the time. I don't know if that is something that we could consider. As we come up with these ideas, even if something doesn't necessarily fit in with the zoning code rewrite, these are all comments that are reviewed by our council as well as our mayor. So they may have an interest in, investing in information technology that does provide that type of noticing or whatever that might be. Don, you had just noted that some noticing after an application is complete, there's some jurisdictions that send out a notice after something's complete electronically. How would we have their email address or an electronic way to communicate with neighbors?
It's to my knowledge, and we did some research on this, but I'm going to have to go. I intended to research it while we're drafting the code, but I have not researched it yet. We did some research on this a while ago. They do it to neighborhood organizations, basically. Most communities do not try to keep a current list of email addresses because they change so frequently and it's just labor intensive. So what they do is they use the neighborhood organization or HOA process to send it out. And that leads, of course, to the same problem. Some HOAs are very good at letting their members know what's going on and some are not. That's the answer to that. To my knowledge, I have not seen any city who has tried to maintain a list of individuals. I do know that we wrote something a few years ago for a community that said, we will send out these types of notices to the registered neighborhood organizations and HOAs. And by the way, if you are in the neighborhood, in the following neighborhoods, and you want to receive notices, we will send it to you too, but we will not, but the day that link goes bad because you moved out of town, you need to keep your links updated. We cannot be updating. If you give us the link and you're in that area or that neighborhood, you don't have to be a member of the registered neighborhood organization, but you're a part of the central bench, or your address is in central bench, for example, and you give us, we'll send it to you too. We're just pressing send to a list. It's the neighborhood organizations and those who've contacted us. When that goes bad, we are not going to go hunting for you. When it goes bad, but if you want it, we'll send it to you.
Okay, thank you. We did have one attendee that is still available, and I think we should probably hear from them to make sure that if they want to provide any input to the committee, they have that opportunity. Melissa, are you available? Do you have anything you'd like to communicate to the Citywide Advisory Committee?
Hi there.
Hi.
Sure. I hope I didn't miss this because I did miss part of the meeting. But I live in the Sycamore overlay and we've all been trying to figure out how we'll be affected because our original zoning of R1A is now gone as I see it. And so a neighborhood with large lots is now being downgraded to 9,000 square feet. So I'm just curious, we did see something in there that said that your lot couldn't be decreased by more than 75% of your neighbor's lot. And I don't know exactly what that means and if that would help us to protect our lot sizes, or if we're all going to just be divided up into 9,000 square foot lots. So how does a big, 3/4 acre lot that was once R1A fit into R1B and how can we protect the neighborhoods that we bought into and expected to, to continue in this
Yeah.
plan.
I think the best thing that we can tell you is that, yes, as part of Module 1, we did recommend the consolidation of R1A and R1B to become one singular zone of R1B. We also proposed to continue with the Sycamore overlay, character overlay. So those are in the proposal. They are out there for public comment. And so we are really taking a look at, what our community is saying. So nothing is complete at this time. So if you would like to provide input, I think the best way to do that is to follow us. We'll have a public survey available on February 24th. You're welcome to email us, and then we'll take that into consideration as we make those modifications for that consolidated plan.
But I guess, we've all commented, a lot of people have, but what I'm wondering is, what are our options at this point? Or are we just pretty much out of any options of the neighborhood we thought we had bought into? I know that Dawn said something like you weren't asking any neighborhoods to completely give up the neighborhood they'd bought into, but it seems like our neighborhood is being asked to give up the neighborhood where we live. So how does that work in this plan?
Well, if I could comment, Melissa, I think you have 2 or 3 options. One is what I heard you say is you don't like that consolidation. And you're not the first person to say that. There are several people in that area who have said they hope that when the consolidated draft comes out, that R1A or something like it will be put in there. That is still under discussion at the city. So I hear you. And the bottom line is the way this works is you won't see that change if that change is made until the consolidated draft, for the reasons Andrea said at the beginning of the meeting. That doesn't mean we haven't heard you. It means we don't revise Module 1 each time we put out Module 2 and Module 3. But that comment has been heard, I think, loud and clear. The second way you could do it, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I presume your real comment is you wish that wouldn't happen at all. If it is going to happen, the other way that some communities can do it is to say, yes, but your ability, we're doing that to simplify the code, and because the plan doesn't call for that. You exist in the city of Boise, but the plan doesn't call for half-acre lots. And how do we deal with that fairly? And the answer is we don't carry forward the R1A, but we have rules about who can subdivide and how many lots you can create. And it may be that you are fine, you're in a zone district that is not a half-acre or 20,000 square foot zone district, but you don't have a right to subdivide an existing lot into those smaller lots. That's a subdivision rule that would say, yes, you are in R1B, but your ability to subdivide it is limited because of the history of the property. So there are a couple of them, and I think both of those are on the table. You can put it in writing, and that would be great, but the short answer is there are at least 2 options that would get you part of what you'd like. And I think the first one was clearly under discussion. The second one I've just said is something we can discuss. But the decision on that isn't going to be made in terms of what is out for the consolidated draft until that comes out later in the summer. Okay.
And then that 75% decrease in the lot, does that apply to us at all?
I am trying to find that provision. I apologize, but if you could point me to the page, somebody.
Multiple people have brought that up. I think that was actually an accident in the code, and I don't think that's something that we would like. I think it's on page like 11, 12, or 13, if I recall correctly.
Oh, okay, all right, okay. So I plead
ignorant. It's in a footnote.
I would have to go reread it, Melissa, to remember where that was supposed to apply. I'm trying to do it now, but thinking on the fly and reading a code on the fly is not a recommended strategy. But I'll take your third option is there a way of interpreting that in a way that would help you protect your neighborhood in the way you want to? Is that right?
Yeah, I didn't want to bring it up if it was going to be removed. I brought it up because I thought it might actually protect us.
I understand. And I'm pleading that I have
and
to
I understand it's hard to find. It's in a little tiny blurb.
Okay, well, why don't we note that you have raised it, we'll find it and put that on the table too as.
It's on page
Andrea-
14.
All right, Andrea thinks it's a mistake and we admit freely to the fact that we make mistakes. And so if it is, it is. If it's a creative idea, then that's what it is. Okay, okay. Take a look.
Oh, I see it on page 11.
Pagination differs based on how you printed out the code, so it doesn't.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, because
Oh, I
it is,
see.
it says on blocks plat an effective date, minimum lot size, lot width, and lot frontage shall not be less than 75% of the two occupied residential properties.
I'm looking at that. Like, give me just a second and I'll
I
violate.
think
Yeah,
that's
it's a-
showing up on all the zonings.
Mhm.
Oh, is it? Okay. Yeah. I'm looking at table 11.2.5
So
for the
once
lot
again,
standards.
thank you. I found it. I found
Oh,
it. Once again, we're conducting a public meeting here. You've raised a good point. Andrea thinks it was a mistake. I think that may have been one of the attempts we made to say exactly what I said in my second option, which is if you existed on the effective, if you walk in the door in the future in zone R1B, you're going to have a 9,000 square foot lot size. If you existed on the effective date of this code and you want to subdivide, you're not going to create parcels that are less than 3/4 the size of the parcels on either side of you. So,
Okay.
As it reads, it would provide you some protection.
Mhm.
And I don't want to get crosswise with my client, but I can't remember. I don't know whether it's a mistake or whether that was an attempt to try to afford some level of protection, bring the code closer to Blueprint Boise while offering some protection for people who had already platted lots. So somewhere in the middle of that, we will take it seriously, and I don't know which of those is true.
Okay, thank you. That sounded like it kind of referred to what you said about no one having to radically change the neighborhood they moved into. So hopefully it'll stay. Thank you.
All right, that is the only attendee that we have. So, we do have, it looks like it's just after 5. So unless anybody else has anything else that they would like to add, I think it's safe to say that we can probably close out today's meeting and really be thinking about how we want to look at module 3 as we move forward.
Thank you all. It's good to see you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.